Again, and welcome back to my video series on the Gospel of John, in particular the prologue of John. And a couple of videos ago, I asked the question about, did Jesus pre-exist his earthly life by pre-existing in heaven? So I want to return to that subject today, and I'm going to again have a look at the writings of G.B. Caird in his New Testament theology. We looked at some of his comments previously, but I want to look now at page 339 of his book, and it's the subheading on pre-existence, and he has some interesting comments about pre-existence. So I'll just read to you what he has to say. So the final means by which Jesus is said to be qualified to bring salvation is by having a pre-cosmic existence. And yet again, we must proceed with caution, he says. While Jewish antecedents explain much of the terminology used in John and Paul and Hebrews to describe the pre-existence of Christ, we have seen that there is all the difference in the world between a pre-existent personification and a pre-existent person. And he says, for instance, wisdom was never the latter. So I'll just repeat that. So he's saying that there is all the difference in the world between talking about a pre-existent personification and speaking about a pre-existent person. So when we're talking about Jewish wisdom, Sophia in Greek, then wisdom was never the latter, was never a pre-existent person. So when John uses the terminology of wisdom from Proverbs chapter 8, he's using wisdom as a personification, never as a person. Now he goes on to say, from where then did the idea arise that Jesus existed as a person in heaven? In attempting to answer this question, there are three dangers we must initially guard against. The first is to assume that, as with pre-existent, the terms eternal and eternity must be or may be invoked. So you get the point. He's saying that just when we talk about pre-existent, we're not necessarily meaning eternal and eternity. These are not terms that you have to think of immediately as soon as you talk about pre-existent, because eternity, there's only the eternal, the unhypothetical first principle in philosophy. The creator God is the first principle, the only one alone having eternal life, eternity. Now that means that they're out with time. There is no time that they never existed. They always exist, never die, have always, will always exist. So that's what eternity means. But pre-existent does not necessarily encapsulate eternity. So we need to be aware of that. Caird is saying. So he goes on to say, it's all too easy to assume that time is characteristic of earth and eternity and of heaven, that pre-existence and post-existence belong to heaven, whatever may be the thought of the interlude of earthly life. Now, he goes on to say that the second danger is that the pre-existence of Christ may be explained by the notion that Jesus pre-existed as a man. He talks about Reitzenstein's theory that the New Testament belief in the pre-existence of Christ was derived from a Greco-Oriental anthropos myth, the heavenly man. And that has survived for a number of advocates today. They still talk about the anthropos, heavenly man myth. But he goes on to talk about the Apostle Paul's thinking on this. He says that we saw earlier that for Paul, the man from heaven, which he equates with Jesus, the man from heaven is second, not first in time. And to be sure, the fourth gospel speaks of the Son of Man as having come down from heaven. But if we press this form of language to the point of insisting that he must have pre-existed as a man, we shall find ourselves in deep trouble. Okay, so when he's saying when the Gospel of John, which it does say in places where it talks about Jesus being sent and coming from heaven as the Son of Man coming down from heaven, but he says if we press this form of language to the point of insisting that he must have pre-existed literally as a man, we find ourselves in deep trouble. He says, for later in the Gospel, Jesus claims also to be the living bread which came down from heaven, and then goes on to explain that this bread which he gives for the life of the world is his flesh. So really, we're talking about mythological, metaphorical language here when Jesus is saying that he came down from heaven, that he is the bread of life that came down. So he's alluding to the manna in the wilderness that the Exodus Jews ate from, a heavenly provision. But we wouldn't think for a minute that literal bread or this manna, this heavenly bread, was actually from heaven, that it existed materially in heaven and then descended from heaven onto the earth. No, we're talking about mythological, metaphorical language here. So Baird goes on to say, I keep saying Baird, it's Caird, G.P. Caird. He says, Jesus cannot be thought to have pre-existed as bread, still less as flesh. Flesh is what the Logos became at the incarnation, and in John's vocabulary, flesh means humanity. So that's the second point to be aware of. The third danger, he says, is best deferred until the following point has been made. And he refers to the tractate Bereshith Rabbah, opens with a paragraph based on Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 30, in which the Torah is said to be the blueprint which God consulted when making the world. So remember, I used that analogy also, talking about the idea in God's mind forms a blueprint, a model, and then creates the reality. So it's talking about the Bereshith Rabbah, saying that the Torah is the blueprint that God consults making the world. He says this interpretation was much older than the Midrash in which it occurs, and indeed was almost certainly known to Paul. And he says, for the identification of the Torah with personified wisdom, this first occurred on Palestinian soil in the writings of Jesus ben Sira of Jerusalem. And it was this that set the rabbis thinking about pre-existence. In two places in the Babylonian Talmud, we are told that 7 things existed before the creation. Right? So the Jewish thinking recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbis said 7 things existed before creation. These were the Torah, repentance, paradise, Gehenna, the throne of glory, the temple, and lastly, and most importantly, and the name of the Messiah. So these 7 things existed before creation. But notice, it doesn't say that the Messiah existed. It says the name of the Messiah. And when we're talking in Bible terms, the name of someone generally means not always literally the actual personal name, but it means the office, the position, the authority that one holds. So it's saying that the idea or the authority, that the mission even, the purpose of the Messiah existed before creation. Now, he then goes on to say, according to the rabbis, it was in order to have a race of beings capable of obeying the Torah that God set the creative process in motion. But if our suggestion is correct, then it follows that all pre-existent things could be said to exist in one mode or another within the purpose of God. I'll read that again. all pre-existent things could be said to exist in one mode or another within the purpose of God. So again, he's making the point that these pre-existent things that the Bible speaks of are existing within the purpose of God. It's within his mind. His planned purpose is where these things exist. And that's the pre-existence that we're talking about here. And on that point, I want to go to, in his text, he actually has a few footnotes to various publications, one of which is this one by R.G. Hamilton Kelly, Pre-existence, Wisdom, and the Son of Man. This is an extremely involved study of pre-existence and wisdom in the scriptures, and I intend to return to this at some future point because there's an awful lot in this book to read about. But I wanted to just read from the very first few pages of it in light of what Caird had said there, talking about the types of pre-existence, because Caird had just said there that all pre-existing things could be said to exist in one mode or another. So there's a couple of ways in which things could pre-exist. And this is what Hamilton Kelly speaks about in the first few pages. So he said, Adolf Harnack, another famous theologian, used pre-existence, the term, to signify a theory held by the ancient Jews and by all the ancient Semitic nations that everything of real value which at some time appears on earth exists in heaven perpetually. So again, it's just that idea of there's a heavenly blueprint that God had fashioned that has always existed with him in his mind before they exist in heaven, on earth, I should say. This heavenly existence was of two kinds. Most frequently, the valuable entities were thought to exist in God's knowledge as part of his plan for the world. So notice these familiar phrases recurring here. So these valuable entities thought to exist in God's knowledge as part of his plan for the world. Less frequently, the entities were thought to actually exist in heaven independently in their own right. So the former type of pre-existence Harnack calls ideal. The ideal entities are just as real as those existing in their own right. We suggest that the latter type of pre-existence be called actual. We shall therefore use the terms ideal pre-existence and actual pre-existence. So that these are the two categories that he then uses within his book. So to speak about something existing in God's knowledge as part of his plan in his mind, Hamilton Kelly says we call that ideal pre-existence as opposed to actual pre-existence. He goes on to say, whereas in the mind of man, things can exist only as ideas. In the mind of God, they can and do exist with such a greater degree of reality that the ideas of a human mind, than the ideas in a human mind, that they can be said to have real existence. So whereas man can only think of ideas and have those ideas exist in his mind, when we're talking about God, these ideas exist to a greater degree of reality in his mind that they can be said to have, and we can speak of them as having a real existence. It reminds me of the passage where Jehovah says in the Old Testament that he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think Jesus paraphrases this and says he's the God of the living. Because although these patriarchs had died centuries before, in God's mind they still exist. So he says he can speak of them as if they are alive, because they are alive in God's mind. They still exist as part of God's plan, his purpose they're still real in the sense that as long as they're in God's mind, they exist. So he concludes here, therefore, we accept as a working hypothesis that somewhat strange notion that things have real existence before their manifestation on earth, and that real existence being in the mind of God. Because again, we need to remember when we're reading these passages, the Gospel of John, we're reading first century Jewish idiom. We've got to think about how the first century Jews would understand these writings, not to try and understand them the way the 21st century man might read it. You know, you need to look at it and read it in the mind of the first century Jewish writer. He goes on to talk about, we may at this point distinguish the meaning of ideal pre-existence from that of predestination or foreknowledge. Because he says that entities, that is persons or things, can be said to exist, whereas events are said to happen. Therefore, only entities can pre-exist. For events that are planned and known beforehand, pre-existence is not an accurate description. The precise wording for describing such events is predestination. So we can talk about predestination or foreknowledge or foreordination of events, but we can talk about pre-existence when we're talking about persons or things. Yeah, so that's some interesting thoughts from Hamilton Kelly on pre-existence and how ideal pre-existence is what we're talking about here. The final few comments from Caird. He says on page 342, neither the fourth gospel nor the book of Hebrews ever speaks of the eternal logos or wisdom in terms which compel us to regard it as a person. Right? So although there's mythological, metaphorical language, there's nothing in the language that compels us to think of wisdom as ever being a real person. He says, if we're in the habit of crediting them with such a belief in a pre-existent person and not just a pre-existent purpose, it is because we read them in the light of Paul's theology. And he then goes on to talk about Paul's the passage in Philippians chapter 2, which a lot point to as if it's referring to the heavenly man or the heavenly person of Jesus coming down from heaven to the earth, being found as a man. And he highlights that he says that attempts have been made from time to time to suggest that Paul in Philippians is talking about the human Jesus, with his emptying simply a reversal of the act of Adam. This passage in Philippians 2 is known as the kenotic passage. It's talking about the kenosis of Jesus, the Greek term meaning to empty himself. So Trinitarians look at this passage to say that Jesus emptied himself of his divinity, his divine qualities, to become a man. But Caird is pointing out here that some theologians are thinking about that this might not be what it's talking about, that actually it's talking about what Dr. Dunn, James Dunn, interpreted that passage as being an Adam Christology. It's actually likening Jesus to the second Adam. Unlike Adam, who tried to be like God by eating of the fruit and reaching out to be his own God, to be able to judge good and evil for himself. He tried to be like God, and therefore he died, he failed. This passage in Philippians is talking about Jesus resisting the attempt to be like God. And rather than trying to be something more than what he was, he emptied himself and became a slave to death. So he did the opposite of what Adam did. This is what this passage, more and more modern theologians are now starting to think that this is the proper explanation of this passage. But Caird here, in his mind, he's suggesting that Paul has in his mind that Christ was a pre-existent person. And that's why he uses language. He says he finds it impossible, Paul would find it impossible to imagine his pre-existent existence as anything other than personal. So he thinks here that Paul thinks that Jesus was a pre-existent person. He then makes an intriguing comment. He says, and thus, while the pre-existence of Christ may be described in the language borrowed from wisdom or Torah, because everything we've looked at so far is made the point that the New Testament talks about Jesus being the embodiment of wisdom, which in turn was the embodiment found in the Torah. Really, that Jesus is the new Torah. And this is all personification, of course. So he's saying that even though Jesus has been described in the words referring to personification of wisdom, he says, the new wine of the gospel has burst the linguistic skins into which it has been poured. So it's an intriguing comment, but I think what he's getting at here is that the idea that Jesus pre-existed personally, not ideally, but actually personally before his birth on earth, is Paul putting new wine into an old wineskin, the old wineskin being the terminology, the personification of wisdom, and that the new wine bursts that previous language. It doesn't really make sense. The idea of Jesus being personally pre-existent doesn't fit with the way that wisdom and Torah are personified. Okay, so on that point about Paul's thinking on pre-existence personally of Jesus and this Philippians 2 passage, I want to read to you from John Macquarie in his book Jesus Christ in Modern Thought, which is another excellent book to read. Now on page 55, he refers to another theologian, Trinitarian theologian. He asks the question, first of all, did Paul think of Jesus Christ as a pre-existent being? That's the question he asks. And he says, according to the American preacher William Porcher de Bose, the words I wish to quote from de Bose are these. He says that St. Paul realizes profoundly the truth of the pre-existence and the deity of our Lord. There can be no question, according to de Bose. But Macquarie then says this statement, and there are many others like it in de Bose's writings, would nowadays bring shrill howls of protest, not only from radical theologians like those who contributed to the symposium, The Myth of God Incarnate. And that was a book that was written by a number of British theologians that questioned the literal reality of the incarnation. But would also call forth a demur from many moderate biblical scholars who might perhaps themselves be firm believers in the doctrine of the incarnation, but whose scholarly integrity would compel them to deny the pre-existence and the deity of Jesus Christ, are as clearly taught by Paul as de Bose supposed. So you get that point that even Trinitarian theologians who believe in the doctrine of the incarnation, however, they're honest enough that their scholarly integrity would compel them to deny the pre-existence and the deity of Christ are as clearly taught by Paul as de Bose thinks they are. He goes on to say in page 56 that the incarnation is not exempt from this kind of text. We must not force the biblical text to conform to later developments which are alien to it. Now, that's a great point. And this is what we find is that 4th century Trinitarianism is basically read into the Bible passages that were written in the 1st century. We must not force the biblical text to conform to later developments which are alien to it. So he says, but we are dealing with language that is metaphorical or even mythological, and the language and logic of common sense may not be directly applicable. God's metaphorical sending of his metaphorical Son can be understood in ways that do not imply pre-existence, once we accept that the language is metaphorical and not literal. Here I come back to the views of James Dunn, who does in fact argue that passages in Paul, like Philippians 2, which at first sight seem to entail a doctrine of the pre-existence of Jesus Christ, do not do so. He says that the original background of the passage was probably the stories of the creation and fall in the early chapters of Genesis. So we're talking about a contrast between Adam and Christ, and Adam Christology, as Dunn puts it. Jesus Christ, by contrast to Adam, faced the same archetypal choice that confronted Adam, but chose not as Adam had chosen, that is, to grasp equality with God. Instead, he chose to empty himself of Adam's glory and to embrace Adam's lot. So that's a very good point. He chose to empty himself of Adam's glory, of the perfect humanity that he had, and submitted himself to embrace Adam's lot of suffering and dying. So it says that this is what is popularly called Christology from below, or anabatic Christology. This second type of interpretation not only fits well with the modern insistence on the full humanity of Christ, a view which I have already expressed wholehearted agreement, but also dispenses with the mythological idea of a personal pre-existence of Jesus Christ. It dispenses with the mythological idea of a personal pre-existence of Jesus Christ. He says, it is perfectly compatible with and probably demands the idea that Jesus Christ pre-existed in the mind and purpose of God. And I doubt if one should look for any other kind of pre-existence. As Karl Barth has said about Jesus' pre-existence, he has a basic reality in the counsel of God, which is the basis of all reality. If one wants to go beyond this and claim that Jesus Christ had prior to his birth a conscious, personal pre-existence in heaven, this is not only mythological, but is, I believe, destructive of the true humanity. So there you have it. Both Karl Barth, John Macquarie, and James Dunn are all basically saying that if we're going to talk about Jesus' pre-existence, then we're not talking about a literal personal pre-existence. We can quite happily talk about this ideal pre-existence in the mind and purpose of God, and that ideal existence is in effect real existence in God's mind. So that's some thoughts on that. And finally, just to cap this off, I also want to refer you again, we looked at this before, John A.T. Robinson, 12 More New Testament Studies. And on page 174, this is a bit I'm going to return to as well, because there's so much in it that we can speak about. But in page 174, he really sums up this point that we've been looking at, and looking at how different theologians have looked at this question. So he says, I believe that Caird, G.B. Caird that we've been reading from, I believe that Caird was entirely correct in saying that personification, that is making into a person, making something into a person, talking about something as if it were a person, rather than personalization, actually being a person, is the key to the interpretation of the language of the word wisdom, sonship, etc., derive from the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament. Moreover, that Schoenenberg, a German theologian, and Lampe, British theologian that we've spoke about before, Schoenenberg and Lampe were right in judging that the incarnation means the anhypostatic logos became hypostatic. So hypostatic means a real person, a real being, a real person. Anhypostatic means the opposite, not actually being a real person. So they're saying here that Lampe and Schoenenberg have both said that the logos in heaven, the eternal logos, was anhypostatic. It wasn't a real, actual person, but it became a person in the embodiment of Jesus, that Jesus embodied the principle, the knowledge, everything that the Logos expressed about God the Father, we can now say was embodied in the flesh of Jesus. So something that wasn't a person, but was only a personal a personification, became personified in the man Jesus. So he says, became hypostatic as the self-expressive activity of God is focused in the historical Jesus as a person in the full sense. His human personality was then, and this is the point, his, meaning Jesus, his human personality was then retrojected onto the pre-existent Logos, rather than a pre-existent divine being taking on an impersonal humanity. Right? So he's saying that the common Trinitarian view is that this pre-existent person, this Logos, pre-existing person in heaven, came down from heaven and became a fleshly man. That's the sort of standard Trinitarian view, but he says that's not what John's talking about. He's saying that it's human personality. What the Trinitarianism has done is they've taken Jesus' human fleshly personality and they've retrojected it backwards onto the Logos, rather than the Logos having actually been a real person. They've retrojected that personality onto the impersonal, personified Logos. That's what's happened here. And he says, and unlike others, I do not believe that either Paul, and he says in brackets, as Caird thought, or John, as in brackets, as Dunn supposes, represents an exception to this view. So he's saying that, Caird did think that Paul thought of Jesus as having a personal pre-existence. And James Dunn, in his book, The Making of Christology, he does in the end think that the gospel writer of John does think of Jesus as being personally present in heaven prior to his birth. But Robinson is saying, unlike others, I do not believe that either Paul or John did think that. So it's like the modern scholarship is now coming to the conclusion that even the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul, that they also did not actually think of Jesus as a pre-existent person. They're using the language of the Logos, they're using the language of wisdom, but they're not actually believing that Jesus was a pre-existent person. They're simply retrojecting the personality of Jesus onto the Logos. And then people then think that the Logos was a person. That this is not what's right. It's an anhypostatic Logos became hypostatic. Because if we were to retroject Jesus' personality back into the impersonal, personified Logos, we're effectively putting new wine into old wineskins. This new Trinitarian ideology bursts the old wine bags. They can't. The terminology, the language that the scriptures use are personifications of not to be thought of as hypostatic. Therefore, we shouldn't put these new Trinitarian ideas, Trinitarian wine, into the old wineskins of metaphoric, mythological language. So hopefully that's of interest to you. As I say, I'll return to these books in videos to come, but that's today's thoughts on pre-existence, on ideal pre-existence in the Bible, as opposed to personal pre-existence. So if you've enjoyed this, please press the like button. And if you haven't already subscribed, please press the subscribe. And I hope to see you again for some more future thoughts on the prologue of John. Thanks. Bye for now. Bye-bye.